Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Kingshuk, a researcher at Takshashila Institution. With me is Anupam, who is a professor at Takshashila Institute teaching economics and public policy. Today we'll discuss Bombay Plan, which is an old plan, but we are carrying forward our discussion which we had over a cup of coffee. So let me tell you a bit about Bombay Plan. Bombay Plan was a plan that was made during the heydays of Second World War by a bunch of Indian industrialists and policymakers, which is unique in the post-colonial developmental history because it speaks about developing a new model in which industry plays an active role for the development of the country. So with this background, I would like to ask Anupam, what can you just tell us in brief, what is Bombay Plan?
Thanks, Kingshuk. So, as you mentioned, the Bombay Plan is basically the nickname which is given to a plan for 15 years of economic development for India. And as you said, it came about in 1944, and it was meant to be a plan of what India can achieve by about 1960, right? And this was proposed by a bunch of industrialists and technocrats as well, basically spelling out the vision for economic development for India, right? And it's funny that it was initially meant to be just a private kind of document that all of these people had come together and written it up, but it gained popularity. And with time, it started, a lot of people were interested in what this plan was and what the vision for India was and so on. And so from a private circulation, they actually then created a book out of it, or a pamphlet at least. They created it was published as a pamphlet and was then circulated amongst all the people that were interested in it, right? So very soon, I think other people started getting interested in it. So for example, I think in March 1944 or so, there was FICCI, which is the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. They endorsed this plan in their annual meeting. There was Lord Wavell, who was basically the Viceroy of India. He mentioned it as a kind of a novel approach toward India's economic problems. Various other people, there were the finance member back then who was Jeremy Reisman. I think he welcomed it and he spoke about it, etc. So I think it started off as just a kind of a vision for India for about 15 years that a bunch of industrialists and technocrats got together, and this thing, it soon took a larger than life kind of, it gained gravitas, if you will. There are people who got interested in it. And in many ways, and I'm probably, spoiler alert, I'm also telling you how it ended, but in many ways it was useful, and probably it had a big disproportionate influence in how the economic planning turned out in India. In the first, we'll come back to this idea later, but also that the Bombay Plan as such also died very quick. So it shot to fame pretty early and pretty rapidly, but it also died down in the next few years and nobody mentioned it after that, right? So that's in brief what the Bombay Plan is about.
So as you had given a background of this Bombay Plan, can you tell us something, how did it came about? Like, as I started with the saying, like, it was made during the time when India was under British control. Then, like, there was a raging world war was going on. It was a very dismal time. But how there's a bunch of people comes around and making such a bold plan for the development of the economics?
Yeah, so I think that's what these were, people who were just beyond, I think, industrialists, though we often say that they are industrialists, right? But I think they all had various roles to play. J.R.D. Tata, for example, who is probably one of the most prominent and well-known figures, as we know, who was, the son of Jamshedji Tata. I mean, basically, he was one of India's pioneering industrialists, and he had business interests in iron and steel and the aviation industry and a few other things, etc. But I think we also know from history that took almost a primary interest in the economic development of India, who also had in various ways bets with the British Empire of whether India could produce anything on its own, about the economic sustainability of India. So I think the people involved in this plan were invested in the idea and about the idea of India, that it could be a nation. It could be a nation that will prosper. It would be a nation that could firstly survive and then prosper. I think that was the idea. And so if you look at the other people, Birla, again from the legendary Birla group, GD Birla was involved in it. There was Ardeshir Dalal, who's technocrat, as I think you'd know, and who's, I think, is that also the person where Dalal Street comes from? Maybe. And then, you had Lala Shriram, who was again, prominent Indian journalist, industrialist involved with the Delhi cloth mills, etc. So I think you have a better sense of the people who are involved. So I'll pass it on to you. But just to give you an idea of the kind of people that were involved in the making of the plan, right? So what I'm trying to basically get across is these were, of course, industrialists, but who were quite invested into, the idea of India. Both, I think, from a personal nationalistic pride kind of perspective, that they wanted to see India prosper. But obviously also, if you take a slightly more, almost a cynical view, but I think their businesses would obviously thrive if India prospered. Right? I mean, their businesses would not succeed if the idea of India did not succeed. So they were invested in that sense as well. So from a nationalistic perspective, that they wanted, their country to do well, but also because, their business is entirely dependent on this India surviving and doing well. So who are the other people involved, Kingshuk?
Yeah. So as you pointed out about Mr. J.R.D. Tata, and interestingly, that time, as we know, J.R.D. Tata was, not the one seen or heard about. He was that time a young man who was just joined the House of Tata.
Right.
And even that time, the House of Tatas were one of the legendary business houses in India with a long history of their contribution in different aspects of life. And he was coming up, so he wanted to make his presence felt. He was following the footsteps of Jamshedji Tata, Dorabji Tata, and Sir Ratan Tata. As you have rightly pointed about Mr. Tata. Another stalwart was Mr. Ghanshyam Das Birla from the House of Birla, GD Birla. So he was in a transition that he was making from being a merchant into, he was going to industrialization. He was in the process of setting up textile mills.
Right.
He was the one who has benefited a lot during the wars, as you have pointed out also. Another one eminent person was Karsan Bhai Lalbhai from Ahmedabad. So he comes from a family of eminent merchants. So there in Ahmedabad, they were bestowed with the title of Nagar Seth.
Right.
So, and they have a history of contribution there.
Right.
These were some of the industries. And also you said about Ardeshir Dalal. Ardeshir Dalal was the person who was a technocrat who had played a key role for the House of Tatas also. And he was part of the government.
Yeah.
He stood second in ICS examination. He went to Britain on a Tata scholarship. Also, there was John Mathai, Dr. John Mathai, who went on to become the Finance Minister of India. So I think, as you have said, all these people, more than their immediate business interests, they were fired up by the nationalism. So they want to see their country grow. Because as we have seen, during that era, while the World War was going on, Indian economy was growing. From deficit, we had a surplus for first time in the history. So that, I think, made them a bit ambitious, made them to have a dream for their country, for a better future. There will be very few parallels, when a country is under colonization and the economic scenario, political scenario world over is bad. A bunch of people come together, draw up a plan that is very revolutionary in its outlook. Carrying this forward, Anupam, can you tell some of the features of this plan?
Yeah. So this is where actually I will differ slightly from you. When, for instance, when you say it was revolutionary in nature, I think I disagree. It was extremely traditional in its outlook. That's my reading of the entire Bombay Plan. And I think we have to put this, before I actually go into the features of the Bombay Plan, I want to put this in a bit of global economic context, right? Which is to say that you had the Great Depression that happened in the 1930s. Keynes then came along and obviously wrote his landmark book, and then basically, which then translated into the US fiscal policies, right? Which is big deficit financing big government expenditure, large infrastructure projects, and so on. And that kind of formed the basis for the American growth in the 1930s and so on before they entered into the World War. Then, much later on came the Marshall Plan, but also heavily influenced by this kind of thinking in terms of big expenditure by government, right? So you have to locate the Bombay Plan in this context, which is to say that at that point of time, it was quite fashionable to propose, and it was part of the trend to propose big government expenditure. And so therefore it was not revolutionary, right? It was going not against the mill, but very much in the same course that other countries were going on at that point of time. So now coming to the features, right? I think a key kind of principle of this entire Bombay Plan was that the economy could not grow, and that's the belief was that the economy could not grow without quite a big government intervention and, of course, regulation, right? So the assumption here was that some of the fledgling kind of Indian business houses would be extremely vulnerable. They were established in many ways, but they were still vulnerable to foreign competition and therefore could not compete very effectively in a fully free market, open trade systems. And so they almost then asked for, or even in some cases, if you want to be slightly more dramatic, they even begged for government intervention. So government intervention in the form of whether it is, protecting infant industries, protecting indigenous industries through what would later be known as import substitution techniques, right? Put heavy tariffs on trade, imports of material, give subsidy and other kinds of government kind of patronage to the Indian business houses and so on. So that was what they'd asked for, right? But beyond that, there was also other salient kind of points, which is that they'd asked for heavy government intervention in other parts where they were not directly involved. So things like, they made a point for deficit financing because they understood that the government of India would not have a lot of revenue and that it would be okay for the government to spend money that it did not have on things like, infrastructure, which I think was required. But they'd also made the case for trying to say that government should spend on redistribution efforts, that, it should be a welfare government, right? Now, you can slice and dice this in many ways, but the idea was that these 8 industrial houses, these 8 industrious belonging to various industrial houses asked for basically protection from foreign competition. They asked for heavy government patronage in various ways. Then they asked for things which would, of course, help them, such as better infrastructure. All of this was complemented by saying we should have a welfare state. We should, do some form of redistribution of wealth and income so that people don't lose out. There was also things like, so then they said that the government should focus on other areas which private enterprises could not, such as mining, power, metallurgy, engineering, chemicals, transport, cement. So they said these are what you would in economics you would call these as natural monopolies. That is, things which have high fixed cost, huge gestation period, etc., where you could not have true competition. So I said the government should actually step in, take on some of these things and establish, right? Now, see, over the years, you could look at this in various ways. In the sense that you could say that this is one kind of vision for India in how it could develop. But you could also take, and I'm veering towards this, you could also take a highly cynical kind of approach towards looking at it, which is to say that the industrialists asked for protection. The industrialists asked for things that would help them grow, which is power and so on. The industrialists also made sure that they had demand for their products. That is how you'd get, through a welfare state, right? So that's a cynical thing. We'll come to the criticism later, but just to kind of put that in context here, right? Yeah.
Anupam, that knowing that you are an advocate of free market and you disdain government interference, but don't you think we have to look at the context? Like, as you rightly pointed out, the world economy had just passed out of the Great Depression. Around that time, world was raging. So during that time, market has failed to an extent. And you have also mentioned about Lord Keynes, about his famous book, The General Theory of Employment. And so, can you tell us about that context? World was also raging. There was a strong intellectual debate was going on between Lord Keynes at one side from Cambridge School, another was led by Friedrich von Hayek of LSE. So the contrast between these two ideologies, like whether government is right, like, or there should be a government interference should be there, or market can on its own evolve like what should be, as Adam Smith in Invisible Hand had said before. So can you please walk us through this time and the debate?
Fantastic. Okay. First, let me put a disclaimer that you asked for it. Okay. So if I get into my lecture mode, but I think it's interesting. If you look at the intellectual climate of that period, as you rightly contextualize it, there was a lot of debate on whether you should have heavy government intervention in market, which was what Keynes was saying, or a more free market kind of economy, which hike. And this is highly simplified version. I mean, I'm extremely aware that I'm almost simplifying it to the point of being absurd, but nonetheless, right? If we can go with that pretense for now. Now, even there, I have to bring in this nuance that Keynes did not say that the government should start developing its own industries. Neither did Keynes say that we should have a protectionist environment, right? Keynes only said that in times of economic crisis, there's a heavy role for the government to play, which is to come in, do deficit financing, pump priming the economy. You can call it whatever it is, but jumpstart the economy. And it was only that. Right? Fiscal stimulus at the time of crisis is what Keynes said. It did not say that when things are all well, the government should start mining and doing metallurgy or producing power. That was not what Keynes said. So I think even there, if the people who supported the Bombay Plan are trying to justify it, saying that it is drawing upon the intellectual basis of John Maynard Keynes, I think that would be a false statement because, as I said, Keynes did not argue for those things when times are good, right? And there is no evidence to suggest, India was about to be a free, independent country. We didn't know if it was going to enter into it in a crisis. We didn't know if it was going to be a stagnation, recession. We had no clue. So to assume that we're going to have a recession and then therefore requires government intervention, I think is false. In fact, in many areas, India would have benefited largely from having a lot more entrepreneurial spirit right from the beginning instead of heavy-handed government approach. Okay, so that is part A. Part B, I think if you look at it in terms of global context, it's again interesting. It's selective there again, right? Which is to say that there were countries, of course, which were ravaged by war and therefore required the help of government in reconstruction and development, which is what, again, Europe got Marshall Plan routed through the governments and then did reconstruction and development. The US also had, the entire period in the 30s and 40s where you had your entire expenditure in infrastructure. Now, if we say that that is the practice of the day, which justifies Indian government intervention, fine, I'm willing to take it. But it is only up to a point, which is, again, public goods. And if we look at infrastructure as that kind of demon in between public goods and positive externality, fine, I'll take that. But this goes far beyond that. This went into the territory of saying that the government should own airways. This said that the government should own mining and metals and cement and all of these. These are proper private goods. There was no justification for the government to have, Air India. The effect of which is seen 40 years or 50 years hence, right? So irrespective of what justification you use, I think you'll fall short and therefore, makes way for my far more cynical view of this entire thing. Now, just beyond that, third point, and I think this is important, if you again contextualize it in terms of what is happening in the globe, just post-World War, the entire world, not the entire world, most of the developed world which India was looking up to in terms of, how do we shape this thing, went for a far more open trading system, right? That is when, you had the Bretton Woods system, you had countries which said that let's not go into this competitive devaluation, competitive trade barriers, etc. Let's actually open it up. Let's have free trade amongst ourselves. India didn't go that way. India was scared. And again, if you remember the first 5-year plan, which was in effect in India, which is from 1950 onwards, and then the second 5-year plan, which Mahalanobis was involved, draws heavily upon the Bombay Plan. And that intellectual influences between the Bombay Plan and the first 2 5-year plans at least cannot be diminished at all. You have to recognize it, right? And in that period, we go for a heavy protectionist approach, right? We have massive trade barriers. We have something called the Open General License. We have state procurement. We have everything that you could, that proponent of free market and free trade would absolutely, detest. You had all of those elements, which I would say contributed significantly to India's middling growth, high unemployment, low consumer choice, the entire, and then basically a killing of the entrepreneurial spirit in India.
So, as you said, I agree with you, but there's one common ground between both Lord Keynes and Friedrich von Hayek, both were for liberty and democracy.
Yeah.
And in the hindsight, to judge them the way we are looking at the planners of Bombay Plan now, when the first draft of the plan came out in 1944, that time they were highly influenced by Lord Keynes. But afterward, with the publication of Friedrich von Hayek's landmark book, The Road to Serfdom, they took that into consideration.
I don't think so. I don't think so. All of this, ultimately, I don't think Indian economic planning is as much influenced as we'd like to think by the intellectual debates around the world. I would still think that people are moved by incentives, and established industrial houses have an incentive to ask for protection. That's, I think, irrespective of what intellectuals of that time say. You can always then post facto justify it, saying Keynes said this and so on. As I've said, the context in which Keynes was asking for government intervention did not exist for India. So, you can't really use that as an excuse to say, we have the Bombay Plan. So the important thing to remember here is that many of the industrialists who are involved in the Bombay Plan stood to gain by the measures adopted by the Bombay Plan. If we don't recognize it, then I think we're living in a highly idealistic world, saying that 8 people can come and propose things which are truly good for the nation, even though it might hurt them. No. They said things which they thought would help India, but obviously would help themselves as well. And that is key, right? So now, even if we don't, and I would like to not attach malicious intent here, okay? That's where I draw the line. I genuinely think that these people thought that this was the best way forward for India. But of course, it was also the best way forward for their own industries.
Okay, fine. Anupam, can you tell, as we have discussed, Bombay Plan relevance for current era? Now, with hindsight, one thing had been proved beyond doubt, that when government tries to be an entrepreneur, it fails miserably, as can be taken the example you gave of Air India. So when Air India was in the house of Tatas, it was one of the finest airlines in the world. People used to set their time in the watch by the time of Air India. So now how it is for everyone to judge that. Another example would be, again, I am telling with hindsight, if you look at the example of the East Asian countries. So the government encouraged rather than the private sector to develop the key and basic industry. They were given credit at a very cheap rate. So these are something that had happened. That time we didn't have, but can you use those experience for current era? In present era, how government can set broader policy framework rather than stifling regulation? So what would be your take on this?
Okay, in terms of, unfortunately, the Bombay Plan has a far greater legacy than even they would have wanted. I say that the demons of the Bombay Plan haunt us in one way or another even today. And let me start with why I say it in such negative terms, right? The Bombay Plan, for instance, said that they did focus that on the industrial composition of the country, and they maintained that the share of agriculture was very high and had to reduce, but at the same time they still gave a lot of importance to agriculture and not enough to, industry and services. Even in their ideal scenario, they said that the share of agriculture, industry and service were supposed to be 40, 35 and 20 respectively, okay, which is far too high for agriculture, right? And in many ways that kind of exists still today. They also emphasized on things like redistribution, on welfare economy, on heavy regulation. In some ways, they emphasize on that, the role of government in all of this, right? Now, obviously that was in existence, as I said, in the first 5-6 planning periods that India had, all the way from Nehru and Malnobis in 1950s, worsened in many ways and tightened, etc. in Indira Gandhi. I don't think you can directly say Bombay Plan is a result, but it forms a tradition. That's it, right? Because it's incremental. It's a part dependence, as you would call it. So at no point will I, blame the Bombay Plan for the travesties of Indira Gandhi's socialism. But I'm saying it just forms the intellectual basis for them, right? And that continued all the way up till 1990s, when, of course, you had the reforms, but not everything was reformed. Land and labor got stuck, and you see kind of elements of that even today, right? So in many ways, I think that's what I said. The kind of small demons of the Bombay Plan haunt us till today, whether directly, indirectly, whether we want it, to what extent we can debate. But there are those elements still present today, right, in terms of intellectual existence. But we haven't really gotten away from this idea of planning, of industrial policy, of the government trying to pick winners. And this, unfortunately, was there part of the Bombay Plan, and it was there as part of the first 5-year plans, and it exists maybe to a lesser extent, but it definitely does exist today. We've officially kind of abolished the Planning Commission and 5-year plans, which I'm very thankful for and I'm very happy about. But we still try to have strong industrial policies. We have things like the PLI, performance-linked incentives, which is nothing but an industrial policy, right? It's the government saying we should manufacture more of this, less of that. We'll give an incentive to this, we'll subsidize that, etc., which is, for me, part of, it's a heavy-handed government approach towards industrial policy, which, again, if we draw upon our own history, should tell us that it will not work, not nearly to the extent that we want it to work. Or, in fact, if we, again, take a slightly more objective view, it would, in fact, end up causing a lot more distortions in the economy, right? Because once the government picks winners, it automatically means that there are losers as well. And so that is a distortion. Right? So in many ways, today the government still does, to maybe a lesser extent, what the Bombay Plan asked the government to do in 1944. Right? Again, not direct correlation or not direct cause and effect, but I'm just saying it happens even today.
Yeah. Taking forward what you have said now, Anupam, how to resolve this paradox? We need reforms. That is key for our economic growth. But as Mr. Gurcharan Das has pointed out, reforms in India happen by stealth. And why reform is such a dirty word? How can we differentiate between what is pro-market and what is pro-business? Pro-market means there will be competition. You will get good at a cheaper rate. It will be good for all. Whereas pro-business means it will help a set of industrialists who is close to government. It will lead to crony capitalism. It will lead to corruption. It will lead to nepotism. But how to overcome this paradox? Because you wear two hats, as an economist and as a policy professor. So how you see to that? I
would say those two hats are the same. I'm a policy wonk using economic analysis, which I think every policy wonk should. But there are no easy answers as to how do you reform the Indian economy. If I knew that answer, then I wouldn't be sitting here recording a podcast with you, Kingshuk. I would be in I would be in PMO. But I think the idea is still quite easy. The implementation part is obviously a lot harder. But many of these things have been reformed over the last 20 years or so. Slow incremental progress has been made. And then out of the blue, we tend to take dramatic and drastic kind of U-turns, which I think we are doing now in terms of, again, Atmanirbhar and PLI schemes and higher tariffs on certain things, etc. So we do tend to take U-turns, but over time, you look at the last 30 years, I think some form of reforms have been achieved and continue to be achieved, right? But there are other reforms that have spectacularly failed. If you look at, for example, what happened in the farm laws, that's a very good example of how a reform that is, I think, very much needed and required, which would have transformed the agricultural sector. I have no two words about it. I would put my weight behind the farm laws, right? increasing weight behind the farmers, if I have to mention. But I think that is something which was important. But the way they did it was obviously not conducive in a democratic process. They tried to bulldoze their way through and establish those reforms. There was a lot of resistance. Then they didn't try to negotiate initially, whatever, right? But we know what happened. But it failed because of lack of whatever due process. It didn't go through parliamentary committees. It didn't really involve the stakeholders in making those reforms, etc. Reforms, unfortunately, in certain sense, is a dirty word, because you look at the agricultural sector, you look at labor, there's still political opposition to it, etc. But this is where I think you have to be very careful in selecting the areas in which you put your political weight behind. How do you use your political will? Right? This idea of political will is something important. So if you have, for instance, as this current government does, a majority in the houses of parliament, and you have, for whatever reason, a huge popularity among your voter base, how can you use that constructively to bring about these reforms? If you could do something like demonetization and actually get away with it, with even, people wishing you good luck for it and praising you for that effort while going through immense hardship for it, I think lack of political will is no longer an excuse, right? I mean, you can actually, if you can do demonetization, you can do labor reforms, you can do farm reforms, you can do something else, right? That's my story behind this. So you have a government which is immensely popular. If it really cares about, I think it should do. So unfortunately, in the last 3-4 years, as I mentioned, we seem to have gone back into using that political will to bring back elements of protectionism. We bring back elements of crony capitalism, bring back elements of old style, self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, all that crap. Instead of which we should be looking at saying, how do we reform some of these really tough sectors in the economy, which will then propel us towards into the new economy where India can be the leader in fact in global trade, higher integration into global trade instead of receding away from it.
We are coming towards the end of the podcast, so I will ask you one last question. Like, taking the Bombay planners, were they naive in thinking, there can be a collaboration between the government and the business, they'll work together? Because in this age, the way the world is changing with technology and all those things coming, it is not possible for any one single entity, be it the government, how big it is, for that matter, to run the economy or understand it in the first place. So in this era, how can the government and the industry work together in a harmonious in developing the economy? So in recent past, the Bombay Plan, they provided the intellectual framework. Did it succeed? It didn't succeed. That is a different story. But that is one of the cases where intellectual framework and input was given to government. But if you look in the present era, we don't see much. You can find very few examples. One of them would be during the last leg of Planning Commission, Arun Mehra was brought in as an industry expert for Planning Commission, but he could not do much. He was literally hounded out, but that is a failure. But I'll end up so with a successful one. If you look at the Aadhaar thing, it is the world most sophisticated and largest rollout of IDs. Even Nobel laureate Paul Romer has said on this. It is the most sophisticated ID in the world. And it was done by Nandan Nilekani. He's very much part of industry. He worked with government. We see the positive result like this. So how, and another thing, as it is a last question, Anupam, I would request you to end on a more optimistic note rather than being a...
Yeah, actually, I'm going to end on an extremely optimistic note. I get scared when we say government and business should work together, because the question is which businesses, right? And that immediately will lead and make the pathway for, as we already saw, crony capitalism, right? The government already works very well with businesses, but certain businesses at the expense of other businesses, which we don't want, right? So in fact, if you look at it at a very broad level in terms of industry-government harmonious relationship, the best thing that the government can do is get out of the way. Just get out of the way, ease your regulation, bring in ease of doing business, make it easy for businesses to thrive and so on. At the same time, of course, There has to be constraints. Businesses cannot do whatever they want. There can be market failures. So the role of the government is in correcting those market failures. So if you have an industry which relies heavily on polluting the world, then yes, you need government regulation there in order to stop that. If you have businesses which will harm consumers in whatever way, you have a judicial system to stop that. If you have markets which don't exist in certain places, which is what you would call as public goods, then you have the government stepping in and doing that, right? But the role of the government should be confined to these things. One, ensuring property rights, ensuring law and order, providing services to industries, which means, things like good infrastructure, having a good port, having roads and railways and so on, which is good for everybody, including businesses, right? Then opening up markets, not really constraining them, not limiting them, right? And then having regulation in place where the markets fail. That is the role of the government. If it does these things well, I think industry will prosper. Right? You don't need anything more than that. And we've seen success stories of this in various parts. In certain industries, by the way, the IT industry, which is the shining example in India, is a perfect example of an industry doing extremely well because the government left it alone. It just happened by stealth. I mean, government was not aware, they didn't do anything, and it flourished. In other cases where the government said, we will intervene, we will help, and so on, nothing has happened. Right? And so I think the big takeaway from all of this is the best thing that a government can do to help industry is to get out of the way, provide the basic necessities like, as I said, infrastructure, property rights, all of those things. And I think you'll have a wonderful relationship and Indian industry can prosper.
Thank you, Anupam, for your insights and some of the very strong views. I hope some people in government do listen. And with this, we'll end today's podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.